It was an image that came to me, a figure in the woods, lost, stumbling, searching, reaching out. It was an illustration of a type of virtual reality and how we project onto the world what we've been taught and told to see, looking out onto the world but surrounded by our own mind. That was me in my late 20s. I had taken the bus to Golden Gate Park with my camera, tripod, and this miniature house that I was using as a mask to shoot the scene. I was shooting in black and white Super 8 film with no script or story. I was shooting in the dark, as they say, building a film image by image. The story would come later. I was living in San Francisco and I had a grant from the Film Arts Foundation, and I was a young adult and was developing this project, making masks, drawing storyboards, and writing down ideas, but going nowhere. One day I came home after getting this phone call at work, my brother telling me that my dad had died, heart failure, while in church. My girlfriend was in the middle of painting a procession of masked celebrants, and they carried a coffin which had a spirit, like smoke, rising from inside it. I told her, "Your painting has come true. My dad died." San Francisco at the time of the late 1980s and early 1990s still had a bit of that flowers in the hair spirit, and rents were relatively cheap, and I always lived with roommates in one place or another, and the people I surrounded myself with were either artists or alternative types who embraced the spirit of the 60s and the hippies and all that. I was struggling with some kind of undiagnosed chronic headiness since childhood. I had difficulty with intimacy and being present and relaxed. I lived half in my head, never feeling fully connected. I managed to live and socialize and work and get things done, but this was very real for me. I was in ways cut off from my own self. I had gotten involved with the experimental film community in San Francisco. Mostly, I just felt my way through the films. I was in love with the montage sequence, a sequence of images that would illustrate a theme, a feeling, or a story. I had the sense of an audience with experimental film. I was synthesizing my life in San Francisco, responding to it, documenting it with Super 8. Living in the city after life in the suburbs changes you, and I was changing, often letting myself be the fly on the wall, the man behind the camera. Some of this I got from my dad, who, when he was a young adult, became a photography enthusiast, and into the 1960s had turned his photographic eye on us, his family, and on other things he cared about, the Chicano movement, and his land up in the Santa Cruz Mountains. In my dad's generation, there was the idea and hope in the mainstream culture that Mexican Americans would basically do what the Italians and most European Americans have done, identify as white. I wanted so much to fit in, and that was the spirit in my family, fitting in, assimilating. I wanted to be colorblind and not put any attention on being Chicano or brown. I found a man who did what was called bioenergetic therapy. He was a Korean man, and he had me making big expressions with my voice and had me thrash around and lash out at a large foam cube or a foam mattress. The sessions took place in a double-doored room so that the sound wouldn't carry and I could scream or yell at the top of my lungs. Through him, I attended other workshops that focused on the movement of energy in the body as a way of emotional healing. Up to that point, I had been somewhat ahead on legs. I didn't navigate the world through my body. One night at a San Francisco Cinematheque screening, I was showing a film and I excitedly turned around and looked around me at the people in the audience. As I looked around, I asked myself, where are those people in the audience like me? Where are the people like my family? Where are the Chicanos, the working class Chicanos that I grew up with? Had I taken the wrong road? I suddenly felt alone and decided there that if I was going to continue with experimental film, I would do it as a Chicano. It was around this time that I was witnessing various acts of violence throughout the city. I hated violence. It was confusing to me. I couldn't understand how anyone could especially hit another person in the face. It hurt that some of these people were young Latino men like me. I wanted to address this violence. I wanted to make something that others could use. The image came to me of a figure thrashing around, blindly expressing some explosive energy within them. If I could just shoot one roll of film, I thought, I'm sure I could think of what to do with the next. A film could come together like a quilt, with little pieces that you fit together, piece by piece, to make a whole. I could afford a couple of rolls of film, so I got to work. I wrote another proposal for funding through the Independent Television Service and the Corporation of Public Broadcasting. Jump Fence was proposed as a story of a young man who is trapped in an environment and cycle of violence. Through the help of spirit animals and tricksters, he leaves his surroundings and is led into the deep forest, where he finds grounding, emotional healing, and strength. The story idea and the clips that I provided as work in progress landed me the funding. Mostly what I knew I wanted to say was that nature and the natural world held something for us in our hope for healing and wholeness. It was a somewhat simple idea, but one that I could embody from first-hand experience, since I've always had a deep connection with the natural world, from my dad's love of fruit trees and planting and grafting to our land in the mountains. I remember my therapist once telling me that he was surprised that I had come from a big Chicano family and none of us siblings had been in jail or were addicted to drugs or had killed themselves. Thoughts ran through my head as I sat in that sofa chair, and images of my family, humorous, connected, full of creativity, and with this place my dad loved, his land, his fruit trees, the miracle of seeds and roots. With the distresses we grew up with, we also had some things intact. Up to this point, as an artist, I saw myself as a filmmaker, behind the camera. But I decided that within a mask, I was willing to be in front of the camera. I thought it was good for me to use my body, to move about, to express, and act out these different characters. It was like gestalt therapy, where you sit and talk to your father, but are actually talking to an empty chair. I was feeling out the various parts of my own inner self, externalizing the energies, bringing them into a cinematic conversation, kind of like psychodrama therapy. Catman, as I called him, is the main character. His story arc is the arc of the film. First portrayed as victim of violence, showing yearning for connection and wholeness, strengthened by a mentor and a journey into the wilderness, breaking the cycle of oppression and reconnecting to nature. The oppressor, as they called him, is oppression itself. Generational trauma, the energy of internalized expression, one beating up on oneself within their mind. He is like a pattern, a machine, not human, unconscious. The one character I called the Lion Man is a force of nature, the integrated body, wise and anchored in the natural world. Animal wisdom, animal strength. He is the trickster in the dream, jumping the fence to the other side, going beyond the box, beyond the suburban grid. You follow him, and suddenly he abandons you, and you have to fend for yourself. Then there are these large, metallic, floating baby heads. They're the lingering, frozen cry of depression. I was also paying homage to the Mexican artist David Alfaro Siqueiros, particularly his painting Echo of a Scream that had inspired me to become an artist at the age of 8. The world of Jump Fence had to have a whimsical quality about it, like dreams and fairy tales. Some shots of the house, for example, were actually miniatures. Fences made of popsicle sticks, and trees made of papier-mâché. For me, the ideology of Jump Fence lays in these 3 tenets: the land, the body, and the psyche. The land is out of balance, the natural world cut up, covered by the modern industrial technological world, the colonized world, basically. The body of this Chicano youth is caught up in a cycle of violence. His body is harmed, and trauma sets in, and he continues this energy. The psyche is that interplay between feelings in the body and all the ways our minds try to move from a tight, suffering place, yearning for release, but mostly caught in the generational cycle of trauma. These story elements started to surface, and then they needed to play out. I decided that the filmmaking itself would be a kind of ritual that would have me pushing out of my comfort zone, stretching my body and my mind and my heart, integrating them. I was no longer shooting in the dark. The film had a purpose. I took the train down to Sunnyvale once a week to work on the film, some of which took place in my mother's backyard. I remember my mom once saying, "Get your head out of the clouds. You should study computers or something." On one level, she was right. On another level, I was looking for self-knowledge. I needed to know who I was. As young adults, we're supposed to find our place in the world, and this mostly means the work world. I wanted to find my place in the universe. I was coming to the end of telling the story, and it would be the story of how Catman stood up to the suppressor within himself and broke the cycle of violence. It was somewhat simplistic and final, but that's what stories do, simplify. I decided that nothing could better symbolize a healing or a rebirth than to have someone born from the earth, the ground itself. I'd remembered images created by the Cuban-born artist Ana Mendieta, and how she would basically bury herself in the earth as a ritual for becoming whole again within the forces of the primordial world. I wanted the same kind of ritual, and dug a hole in my mom's backyard, covered myself with mud, stepped down into the ground, and then acted as if I was coming up for my first breath. It isn't that I had been healed by making Jump Fence. And emotional healing, I realized, is really a lifelong journey. What I seemed to be doing was embracing Chicano identity for the first time, on my terms, as an artist. By the time I had become interested in this, my dad had passed on. My dad tried to share his interest in Chicano liberation, but it mostly fell on deaf ears on all of us, his children. His experiences with racism were not our own. His concern for farm workers seemed removed from our own lives. I had been raised with the Beatles and Star Trek and Gilligan's Island and the Brady Bunch. These things Chicano didn't mean much to me. I had been somewhat taught not to care, to not identify with those things. Still, looking at the images that my dad captured with the Super 8 camera, I saw just how much he cared about the Chicano cause. This was 1968, near the beginning of the Chicano liberation movement. This event that was planned up at his land must have been something he was very proud of. Chicanos together, Chicano theater, addressing the struggles of the farm worker, up in the mountains, surrounded by the land he loved. his land. Although I plowed ahead in hope of my own healing, I had fallen into the trap of the whole idea of mental illness as something that falls onto the individual instead of something that is indicative of the oppressive system. True healing is to know who you are in community with others and with a connection to the natural world. Jump Fence had its showing at the San Francisco Film Arts Festival and played on various PBS stations throughout the United States as part of a program titled American Independence. But the most satisfying and powerful screening for me was when I showed the film to a group of inmates at San Quentin Prison through an Art in the Prisons program that had artists coming in to share work and talk about it. After screening the film, the men had comments and asked about if it was me acting all the parts, and how did I make the masks, and what materials did I use. Then one man said, "You got the belt too, huh?" I smiled and said yes, and we had a conversation about violence in families and being children, seen but not heard. After my presentation, the director of the program pulled me aside and said that this was the first time she had seen the inmates open up so much about their lives. Later I figured it had something to do with the form of the filmmaking. Had I brought in a documentary on domestic violence or childhood trauma, the whole thing might have felt like school or perhaps too close to home. With this film, the men had various aspects of story and filmmaking to talk about, and some chose to talk about the fantasy aspects and how I made the masks, while others talked about the deeper issues of violence in their own lives.
We'll show a video, and what I'd like to do is...
For me, the whole thing had been sort of like wrestling a demon, inner demons, and I vowed to never make a film like this again. The experimental film community would always be there, but I needed to seek out the Chicano community as well. I look at Jump Fence now as I look at all my work. It's like a diary of those times, a journal of these young adult years, a collection of notes and sketches that lay out my thinking at the time. It's a big piece in understanding what has become my body of work.